Good afternoon. Welcome to the Athens Public Library.
Thank you.
Our guest today is an award-winning author of 12 books and numerous articles, short stories, and poems. Among his awards are the Thurber Treat Prize for Humor Writing awarded by the Thurber House, as well as first place in the Dogwood Fiction Contest. Currently, he is a 2016 Pushcart Prize nominee. He has taught creative writing at Ohio University, Antioch University, and the Gotham Writers Workshop. He is a member of the Historical Novel Society, the Horror Writers Association, and the American Library Association's Author for Libraries. He is a regular speaker at conferences, universities, and libraries, and on podcasts, radio, and TV. Please give a warm applause of welcome for John Kachuba.
Yay, John! Yay! I wanted to go to Antioch College.
It's not too late. So.
No.
Well, thanks, Todd.
Yeah, thank you, Todd.
It's so good to be back in Athens. It's been so long. Mary and I were trying to figure, it's been about 5 or 6 years, I guess, since we've been here. 8 years since we left living here. So it's nice to see so many faces and people we recognize again. So, and thanks again, Todd and the Athens Library for inviting me. You guys have supported me a couple of times, and I appreciate that. So, the book I'm going to talk about is my new historical novel called The Savage Apostle. And just a brief kind of what the book is about. And then I'll go into a little bit more about sort of the history behind the book and why I wrote it and research and open up to any kind of questions you may have. So, Savage Apostle deals with the beginning of King Philip's War in New England, which was 1675. Basically a war between the English colonists in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies and the native population. Ended up in a horrendous conflict that totally decimated what was left of the Native American population in New England for the most part, and destroyed much of the New England economy. Burned a lot of English towns to the ground, totally destroyed things. There are two characters that I follow in this book. One is John Eliot, who was an English missionary in the Plymouth Bay colony. I'll talk about him a little bit more. And the other person is Metacom, who was known as Philip by the English. We call him King Philip. And he was a sachem, a leader of the Wampanoag people at that time. He was the son of Massasoit. Some of these names, if you go back to your old history from grammar school, these names are going to rattling around. Massasoit, Squanto, I remember these guys vaguely. So I'm going to raise your consciousness a little bit and help you remember. So 1620 is when we begin. And if you remember 1620, anybody, what was that date? Anybody know?
The day that the year that Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock.
Give that man a cigar. He's got it. Okay.
Although I don't want a cigar.
All right. So 1620, right? We have a group of English settlers coming to New England. These people we call them the Pilgrims. We call them pilgrims. They're basically Congregationalists. They were basically fleeing religious repression, right? We know that. They went to Holland from England, eventually got their way here. The interesting thing about this is their destination was not Massachusetts, what is say Massachusetts, or Plymouth. They were supposed to settle in an area that was already mapped out by John Smith, if you remember that name from history. And they had a charter from the Virginia colony to settle much further south. They got down there and found that things weren't to their liking for a variety of reasons, including hostile native people. So they set sail north and ended up actually on Provincetown, which is if you think of Cape Cod, there's that kind of arm that comes out in the ocean. Provincetown is the tip. That's where they thought they would land. So they set out a scouting party there, only to find that, once again, they ran into native people that were not hostile, but the English decided to intimidate them by firing at them and then stealing their corn. So after that, they had a little skirmish with these people, and they left. They go back on the Mayflower, and eventually they find their way down to Plymouth, which is the iconic, landing at Plymouth Rock. Now, we're not even sure if they actually did step off on this rock that is supposed to be Plymouth Rock. But they settle in Plymouth, which I'll show you the map in a little bit, is south of where Boston is today. It's on the coast. And when they land here, they're thinking, this is the new world. We know that there are indigenous people. We've already had some run-ins with them. But Jamestown in the Virginia area has already been settled, 1608. They're doing fairly well. They have a colony there. It's starting to flourish. So they're thinking there's some opportunity here. And they're pretty sure that for the most part, there's nobody here, except for all these native people who are actually occupying the area that the Pilgrims think is fair game. So if you look, I don't have a, I'll give you an idea here. You can see a black spot, a round black spot that says Plymouth. And then up above, there's a square which says Boston.
Yep.
So they land at what is today Plymouth, and actually it was the site of a Native American village. The villagers there were victims of European diseases. And when they got there, they found literally that they were walking basically in an Indian cemetery for the most part. But the land had been cleared because the Indians had their own crops and corn and whatever. So they thought this is a good place for us to settle. So on the bones of the native people, they built Plymouth. You'll notice that it's in an area that says Wampanoag. Primarily the native people around that area were the Wampanoag, and they're pretty strong people, pretty strong tribe. That became the Plymouth colony. North in Boston was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that was settled a few years after Plymouth. But they had a lot of interaction between themselves. The people in Boston that settled there were more, how would I say it, more liberal, more open than the people in Plymouth, who were basically, they became Congregationalists, and especially in New England, if you've been up there, you see Congregationalist churches everywhere still. And that was the old Pilgrims. All right, so you have a bunch of native people here. So for the most part, the Pilgrims land at Plymouth. They start to establish their colony. They're not really seeing native people. The native people are keeping their distance. They're not having any interaction with them. They know they're out there, and the Wampanoag know that the Pilgrims are here, but they're keeping their distance. Except in March of the following year, 1621, the Pilgrims land in November of 1620. So what is that, maybe 6 months later, in Plymouth, this Wampanoag, well, he's actually not a Wampanoag, but he's an Indian from, I forgot what the other tribe was, but he comes walking into the village, totally on his own, and he greets them in English. And he says, "Welcome, Englishmen." They all go, "Guy speaks English." And then he immediately asks for beer, which the English, I don't think gave him beer or not. But then he knew a couple of words. He knew welcome English and beer, which is about all we teach him. But this guy, Samoset, becomes an emissary between the English and the sachem in the area, the leader in the area, who is Massasoit. Massasoit's a name that we've heard many times and that we know. So because of him, the English start to have some interaction with Massasoit. Massasoit is a little bit wary of the English because he's already heard reports of them stealing corn, shooting at native people. He's thinking, I'm not sure about you guys. I'm a little hesitant. But they have some meetings together, and basically Massasoit and the Pilgrims at that point write up a treaty of peace between the two sides. And this lasts for quite some time. So in a peaceful area, this allows Plymouth to grow without any problems. They're not fearful of Indian attacks or anything else like that. So more people are coming over from England, more and more. Plymouth is starting to grow. Massachusetts Bay Colony further north is starting to grow. So there's much more influx here of European people, which, as you can imagine, is putting pressure on native people who live there, who hunt there, who have their crops there, and who already have been really reduced by English disease brought in by fishermen and everything in the previous century. So they're already suffering from things like smallpox, yellow fever. So their numbers are already greatly reduced.
Well, could I ask a question?
Sure,
about the frame before this?
Yes.
Is that somebody's wild imagination that the poor Indian has a loincloth on and all this?
Yeah, we can't, yes.
Yeah.
It's...
I mean, in March? Yeah.
They were tough, Drew, tough people. No, I mean, you're right. It's symbolic.
The next guy's dressed a little more sensibly.
Yes, long pants, long sleeve hats. You're right, exactly right. So right now, this part of New England, the eastern part, the Cape area, Boston, Rhode Island, is fairly peaceful right now. Europeans are there, but they're coexisting with the native population pretty well. So a year later, November 1621, we all know the first Thanksgiving. The Indians come in, they sit down with the Pilgrims, they share a meal. And this is true, it happened. And we've made this, big iconic image like that about that, and we have all these, kind of misty-eyed feelings about how wonderful it was. And it was, up until pretty much about that point. So, I tell you about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was around the Boston area. This is their symbol. And what you can't see, it's a little bit blurred, but there's an Indian standing there holding a bow in one hand, an arrow in the other hand, with the arrow pointed down, indicating peace rather than war. And he's got a ribbon coming out of his mouth, a little word balloon, and in it it says, "Come over and help us." Now, this refers to a saying from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul wrote about having a dream. The Apostle Paul wrote having a dream in which he said he saw a Macedonian, who to Paul would have been a pagan. And the Macedonian said, "Come over and help us." So Paul took that as a missionary appeal, that the Macedonians wanted him to go to Macedonia and bring Christianity, which in fact he did. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony used that as sort of their figure. The native people are calling to us Christians, saying, "Come over and help us." Help us, not meaning give us food or shelter or medical attention or education, means give us Christianity. Now, of course, they had no clue that they were saying that, but the English were saying this is what they're saying. So that was the symbol of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The intentions of that colony were good, which is, in their mind, bringing Christianity to the native population was a good thing. And that's how they would be saved and brought into the real civilized world, etc. So on the right is John Eliot. And he was a reformer after the model of Thomas Hooker back in England. And he followed the Pilgrims. He came to the Plymouth Bay Colony in 1631. So 11 years after Plymouth had been founded, he went to, not Plymouth, but he went up to the Boston area. He settled in Roxbury. And he started developing schools and things like that. But the very first thing he started doing was working with the native population. He was a missionary. So his whole idea was to start preaching to the people and to bring them the light of Christianity. So that was his intention. It was a good-hearted intention because he thought, like so many other people, these people needed to be brought into the fold as Christians. They needed to become not only Christians, but they needed to become European white men, which is never going to happen, right? But that was Eliot's intention with the others. So while this is happening in the East, further west in New England, bad things are happening. In 1637, there's a war between the Pequot tribe, which was a very, very strong tribe based in eastern Connecticut and parts of western Rhode Island, against basically the English colonies. English militia from the colonies in Connecticut, which have already been established, go west, fight the Pequots at Mystic, which was the Pequot stronghold. They surrounded the village, burned it to the ground, killed several hundred men, women, and children. Nobody survived it. Now, the English had Indian allies with them. They had Mohegans as their allies who were fighting the Pequot. And the violence and the destruction and the death was so intense that the Mohegan sachem, a guy named Uncas, said, and I'm paraphrasing, basically, he said, "This is how Europeans fight?" He could not believe the sheer destruction and the death that involved in that. Indian populations warred against each other, but that's not how it happened. Fatalities were slight in between. There was more stealing and taking property rather than killing. This kind of total destruction, burning an entire place, killing everybody, was something that the native population had not seen before, at least not in New England. But now they're saying, we're going to pay attention to this. This is not a good thing. And it's close to the other colonies we're talking about. So going back now to John Eliot, while the war is going on down there, Eliot is still doing his missionary work throughout Massachusetts primarily. And this is kind of a hard map to see. But he established what he called praying villages or praying towns. And what this is where Indians who had become Christianized, heard the word of God and decided we're going to become Christians, came together and lived together. So they left their tribe to come together and live as Christians in these villages that were set up. And as a result of that, they started also taking on European ways more than their tribal brothers who they left. So they're prone to dress more like Englishmen, to speak more like Englishmen, to build shelters more like Englishmen. And there's about 14 villages set up by 1674. Eliot was smart in how he approached the missionary work, because what he did was he translated the Bible, the entire Bible, into Massachusetts, which was an Algonquin language spoken by many of the people up there, including the Wampanoag. He got a Wampanoag guy who spoke both English and Wampanoag, but couldn't write, but could speak both, to tell him sort of phonetically how to write things out. So Eliot writes this Bible, and this becomes a way of converting Indians, because now it's in their own language. The Indians call this talking leaves. You can imagine the leaves of a book. We call them leaves. They thought leaves. But the idea that they can talk was kind of, what do you mean talk? I don't see how this talks. But they finally got that word. So this becomes a way of getting to the people. Eliot also converts other Indians who become missionaries for him. One of the biggest ones is a guy named John Sasson, who sort of triggers the events that lead up to here. Because Sassaman ends up murdered. And nobody knows exactly who did it. But the word comes out that it was the Wampanoag who killed this person for whatever reason. And so because of that, they stand trial. And that's a lot in the book, and I'm not going to go into it because it is part of the book. I don't want to have a spoiler alert. But I do want to read just a little bit about what Eliot thought about Sassaman and his death. This is the very first page. It says, "We buried John Sassaman, but a few days after the soldiers pulled his body from beneath the ice at Assawamsett Pond. The grave diggers struggled to work their spades through the cold, brittle earth, finally gouging out only a shallow grave. Still, it was better he should lie in his hasty grave than wait for spring. Now, as the falling snow of a February storm hissed in the trees, I committed the man's soul to eternity and the mercy of the Lord. Constable Howland, the woman, and the 2 Indian grave diggers from the village shivered beside me in the cold, listening to my eulogy. Snow swirled around the 5 of us huddled at the graveside, at times obliterating us in a white fog, at others revealing us suddenly as ghosts. The cold gnawed at my old bones. The storm muffled my words, but it mattered little. I offered them up to God and heard them rise on the frosty air like the ashes of sacrifice. I could do no more, not for this man." So this is from Eliot's point of view. John Sassaman was a disciple of Eliot. Eliot took him, gave him Christianity, sent him to school, sent him to Harvard, which is, at that time was actually an Indian school. So he studied at Harvard. He had all this trust placed in Sassaman. And Sassaman ends up being an enigma because Eliot sends him to King Philip, to Metacom, as an emissary of Christianity. And Philip says, okay, you can stay here and live among the people and talk. Sassaman, because of his knowledge of English and everything else, starts working on some deals on behalf of Philip, but basically filling his own pocket too. So there's treaties that the English side with Philip, and Philip thinks they're pretty good deals, and they are, maybe, but Sassaman gets his piece of the action as well. So it's hard to say. Eliot can no longer really trust Sassaman entirely, but neither can the Indians trust him either. So he's a man in the middle, caught between 2 cultures. So when he gets murdered, and they drag his body off from under the pond, nobody knows who did it. But 3 Indians are arrested for it, and this causes problems with Philip. So here's some images of Philip, and again, keeping in mind that these are artist renditions. I love the fact that they put a little crown on his head and make him a king, as if the Indians walked around wearing crowns and they were actually kings. But this is in English. You know, if he's the leader, by English minds, that means you're a king, a king or a queen, right? What else would you be? So they call him King Philip, even though his name is Metacom. And these are kind of three fanciful renditions. The one on the end might be closer, but nobody really knows. There was no photos or anything else of him. Nobody really has an idea what he was like. But Philip has a problem because he is seeing Christianity growing among his people. And he's afraid of what it's doing because it's separating them from their own tribalness, if you want to call it that. They're becoming something other than Indian. In fact, a lot of them are moving out. They're leaving the villages, they're leaving the tribal area to go live as white people in villages. So he has difficulty with that. He can see that this is not a good thing. At the same time, he understands some of the benefits of having a peaceful relation with the whites, their technology, their learning. He's not opposed to learning. So this is something that, I'm going to just read just one other section from the book. This is Metacom's reflection on John Eliot, the first time he meets John Eliot. There's a couple of words I'm going to tell you what they mean. There's a word called Owanus, O-W-A-N-U-S, which was the English, the native word for English. So it means an Englishman when I say Owanus. There's a reference here, you'll hear, to a guy named Gookin, who was another missionary. You don't need to know much more than that. So this is Metacom talking about the first time he heard Eliot preach. He spoke of the Owanus God, Jesus Christ, and told them many wonderful stories. Jesus Christ walking upon the waters and calming a storm. Jesus Christ bringing dead men to life. Jesus Christ climbing out of his own grave and being carried up into the sky by spirits. Philip liked very much these Jesus Christ stories and wished to hear more of his deeds. Massasoit gave Eliot leave to return to the village as often as he liked. He came several times, telling the people new stories of Jesus Christ, so that his adventures became as well known to them as those of their own heroes, Gluskabe and Hobamak. These were native gods. More of the people came to listen. Philip understood that Eliot, Gookin, and many others were visiting villages among all the Wampanoag, as well as the Narragansett, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Pennacook. Those are all tribes. The Jesus Christ stories were spreading far and wide among the people. So their destruction was set in motion through children's stories. He could not say how it happened. He knew only that the stories and words of Eliot and the others took root in the hearts of some of the people, confusing them, taking them off the good red road. In time, those afflicted with this heart sickness came to denounce the ancient ways of the people and called Jesus Christ their God. And the Owanus welcomed them and called them brother. Eliot built new villages for these people, leading them from their homes, their families, so that they could live together in the manner of Owanus and be in every particular like them. Soon it came to pass that these praying Indians came back to the people, not to return to the old ways, but to take even more of the people with them to the praying villages. Eliot had given them a new weapon to use against the people, for now the talking leaves spoke in the language of the people. Jesus Christ had learned to speak Massachusetts. So it kind of gives you his idea. So we have this conflict going on. And Eliot and Metacom, as things start to develop, there's more issues besides just religion here. There's issues of land. You know, the Indians feel their hunting rights are being infringed upon. English livestock is going through Indian cornfields, trampling the corn, eating the corn. Land is being taken from Indians in various ways. Of course, Indians have no sense of ownership. They're on their land and somebody comes by with a piece of paper and says, this is my property, from here, from here, from here. And they're totally confused. I have no idea what you're talking about. This piece of paper is a piece of paper. So those kinds of pressures are happening, especially the population growth. The murder of John Sassaman is a trigger point, and there's a trial. And this is really what I consider kind of a flashpoint of King Philip's War. There are all these things building there. But when the verdict comes down, and I'll give you a little spoiler, it's against the Indians, as you can probably imagine. This causes conflict. That eventually leads to King Philip's War, very shortly thereafter. But John Eliot and Philip, for the most part, are trying to keep their sides down. They're trying to keep them at bay. They're trying to avoid a war because both those people realize that a war like this would be completely destructive to everybody, not just the Indians. And they're both right. So they're trying their best to keep it down, yet they have pressure. Eliot knows that the governor of Plymouth, along with some of the other governors of the colonies, want this war because they want the property, they want the land, they want the Indians either taken care of some way or gone. And Philip knows that he's being pressured by a lot of his people. We've got to fight, we've got to fight, we can't stand this anymore. Philip's saying, have you seen their guns? You know. So, this is a quote from Philip. He said, I am determined not to live until I have no country. What he meant by that was he didn't want to lose a country before he died. As long as he was alive, he wanted to know he still had a country. His phrase is not good, but that's a famous quote of his. And King Philip's War breaks out 1675, lasts roughly 3 years. As I said before, the devastation is incredible. Entire English towns are just burned to the ground. It takes the New England economy over a century to regain what it lost. So it's like over 100 years. They lost crops, they lost things like, you know, grist mills and timber mills. They lost so many buildings destroyed, churches destroyed, meeting houses destroyed, towns destroyed, homes destroyed. The English fatalities are not all that high, maybe a couple hundred. The Indian fatalities are much higher, and of course they lose much more. So that was kind of the whole history behind writing The Savage Apostle. Why I wrote it was, I grew up in New England, for one thing. And so I was always interested in history. And this particular history, this New England history, this war, the Pequot War and King Philip's War, always resonated with me because I always thought, what a bum deal it was.
Yeah.
You know, a terrible way to say it. But our history could have been much different had things not been handled this way so early on in our history. King Philip's War, I think, sets the stage for how our government treats Native peoples from that point on right up until today, with the reservation system. I mean, it was sending them to schools, pulling them out of their tribes, trying to educate them, trying to make them white, not letting them speak their own languages, taking their culture, cutting their hair, all that kind of stuff. And if that doesn't work, then you wipe them out. You do Wounded Knee, you do those kinds of things. So I was intrigued by how it could have been different. And I was trying to speculate on it, were there different ways that that war could have been averted or could have taken a different path that then would have taken us down the line more like what happened with Native people in Canada. They had some issues up there too, but they did not go through the wholesale massacre and everything like we did down here in the States. The other thing I was interested in was the idea of racial and religious intolerance. We have a peace treaty at Massasoit Signs that lasts for about 50 years, which is a fairly long time for any treaty between white people and Indians to last. But in the end, you still had conflict. It's about economy, it's about economics, yes, it's about that. But it's also about the fact that these are just people who are the other. They are not white Europeans. They don't think like we do, they don't act like we do, they don't speak like we do, and there's nothing we can do to make them like us. So we have to either convert them and turn them into us, or we have to eliminate them. So it's racial and it's religious intolerance. And when I think today of what is going on today in our own country, you know, Black Lives Matter and those kinds of issues, or when I think of the intolerance that so many people have towards Muslims or other religions that don't think the way they do, I'm thinking that this story is appropriate for today. Because if you read this and think about it, you know, it may give you some ideas to where we're going. My introduction, I apologize for that, because it's very possible. But I did about 8 years of research on this before I finally started getting around to actually writing it. So,
Cool.
you know.
To go to New England to look at any of the archive libraries, or were you able to just have things sent to you where you live?
Most of it was online, and I forgot what it's called, the American, what is it, Antiquarian Society, maybe?
Yeah.
I think that's the title. I may have it a little bit wrong.
Yeah.
But they had some things online that you could look at. So I did that. I used a lot of other books from people who were really well-known scholars, and they had done some of that primary research too, so I didn't have to go back into digging archives myself. Would have been interesting, though, to have maybe done that at some point. I might still, because I'm thinking there could be something, there might be a spin-off of this.
It would be neat if you could actually get invited to go to speak in Massachusetts,
Yeah,
Connecticut, Rhode Island.
Oh, I know.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm trying. I mean, I grew up in Connecticut, you know, and I lived in Rhode Island for a while, too. We just heard Mary was doing some research on, worldcat.org. We're finding out that some Massachusetts libraries now are starting to bring it in, which makes sense. It's your backyard. It's happening in your backyard.
How about the schools?
What's that?
How about the schools?
Yeah, well, I'd like to get into schools. I'm not sure really how to do that, to be honest with you.
That-
You know?
Such a lack in history of education.
Oh, I know.
What the real truth about the settling of America, et cetera.
Right. I mean, the only thing kids learn is what I learned. You know, we
The white
make little
person's
pilgrim
view.
hats and, make
Yeah.
turkeys, and
Yeah.
that was it.
But there's so much more than
Right.
that.
Yes.
I embarrass myself with my lack of knowledge in history, so I apologize in advance. But I'm trying to get a timeline.
Okay.
A few years ago, I learned about the lost colony in the Roanoke.
Uh,
When was this? When did that happen?
About the same time.
Okay.
Jamestown was 1608. Roanoke was just a couple years within, I think, only, I don't know, Todd, if you know, but maybe only 5 years or so in that time frame. Early 1600s was Roanoke.
Okay.
And people don't know, there's an interesting theory about that. If you don't know what Roanoke is, there was an English colony set up in Virginia. People were dropped off and they set up and the ship sails. I don't know, a year later or something, a supply ship comes back in and they find there's nobody left. Everybody's gone. Yet nothing is, it doesn't look like there was any violence or anything else, but the people are gone. But they find on a tree trunk the word Croatan, C-R-O-A-T-A-N, carved in the tree trunk.
quote.
And they don't know what that means, except that there was a tribe in there called Croatan in that area. So they don't know, nobody knows to this day what happens. One theory is that the colonists started hitting hard times. Jamestown had it pretty rough. There was a lot of starvation. In fact, there was cannibalism in Jamestown. So that's how bad it got down there. So Croatan, they think that what happened is these people maybe started running out of food supply and just went to the Indians to live with them because they weren't having difficulties with them. And now there's a group of people down there that they're Native American, but they have like blue eyes and like black hair, almost like Irish or English looking, and there's a name for those folks, and I forgot what it is.
Lumbee.
What is it?
Lumbee Valley Indians.
Lummi Valley?
And a lot of their surnames are matches to the people who were on the ship.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, so they think that the people basically intermarried, that they went to live with the Indians and that was it. But, so that's Croatan.
Lumbee.
Okay, so I wasn't.
Or
too
Roanoke,
far.
that's Roanoke.
But then another point that I'd like to add, if there is certainly a lack in our schools, and I wish I had the answer for getting it in there. I think that one of the issues that, and maybe you've addressed in this, is what is still going on with the First Nation. Now, I notice you use the term Indian respectfully, but I've been criticized for that, and I'm sure you've probably heard that line before too.
I have to, yeah.
Yeah.
I did a project in Manitoba, and what was that, an island there for an old girl from the Midwest. We thought we had problems here. You ain't seen nothing until we see what we're still doing, what the Canadians are still doing to the First Nation people as we sit here today.
Right.
So perhaps this is this addressed in your research here, or is this something that we need to bring up as we, if it were a perfect world, take this into the schools?
Well, that's true, and we're doing it here to Native Americans in America. And you're right, First Nations is a term Canadians use. That's an official government term for the indigenous population of Canada. They call them First Nations. I don't know if we have an official term, but I've written a lot on Native American culture and literature, and so I know a lot of Native American writers and all. And I've asked them about that, like, what term do you use? And you know what, they're all over the board. I mean, some people who are, I'll say Native American to be more official, will call themselves Indian. They'll say Indian. Some people object to that because it's the old Columbus thing, Columbus calling them Indian, Indios.
I don't like
you
that.
know, and so they object to that. But
I don't like
a lot of them say, yeah, Indian, Native American, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on that. They don't like some of the, you know, like Washington Redskins or something like
I
that.
come from Illinois, so I know all about Chiefle.
Yeah, okay.
But that being said, and I'm monopolizing.
That's right.
Well, another personal story. I worked one summer on a Navajo reservation in New Mexico.
Okay.
And I had been cautioned, this was when Chief Illini was just cranking up, and the pro-chief, the anti-chief people.
Right.
So we had been cautioned not to wear any T-shirts that advertised beer, which is not quite my style, or cigars or cigarettes or Indians. And one of my first days there, I had a sit-down meeting with the mental health director, who was wearing a baseball cap that said Atlanta Braves. And I thought it was a setup or something. Maybe they were testing me, and I was sort of like, how awful. And nothing, it was not mentioned, of course. And when I got to know him a little better, I said, why are you wearing this baseball cap? And he took it off and looked at it, and he said, you know, I picked that up at the barber shop. It meant nothing. It meant nothing to him.
Right.
And this is not, you know, in the 50s. This was 5 years ago. So people go both ways on this.
There's a nonprofit group that works with the Lakota people on Pine Ridge, and they call them, it's called Remember. And it's, they take volunteers every summer to help do building things on, but they tell you the same thing. They say, make sure when you come, your clothing is just plain clothing. Don't have any team mascots on there or anything else, because it's not going to go well with some members.
Sure.
You know, they're like us. Not everybody objects to that, but I try to, you know, I do use the word Indian. When I do use it in a respectful manner, but certainly there might be somebody in the audience who might object to that. In
Well,
which case,
and you do use it respectfully, and most of us do.
No, I understand.
But there are two generations of people in Illinois that aren't speaking to each other. Chief Illini.
I know, seriously, right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I've heard the term remember. Funny it's to say that because I've seen it on Facebook somewhere. And I just want to throw out another word, another alternative word for them. Aboriginal, like the Aborigines of Australia.
Yeah. I don't know if we ever use that term.
I think
They do. They say it in Australia and areas like that.
Yeah. The difference between Aboriginal and Aborigines, I think, is important.
Or indigenous people.
Indigenous.
Yeah, indigenous.
Yeah, indigenous is, I mean, you were there.
You get one time.
True.
And where did that first fellow learn his English? Had he been in contact with the other?
Oh, well, no, he had been in contact with fishermen. You know, it turns out that we think, okay, pilgrims came and discovered, well, they didn't discover, I mean, since the 1500s, there were English people and some other European powers that were coming up and down the coast, little landing parties, mapping out areas, or fishermen. You know, a lot of fishermen, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, down through Maine. And he may have been a Penobscot from Maine, what is today Maine. And so he would have had contact. They say that's where he got it from, listening to fishermen. Fishermen drink a lot of beer, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
And codfish.
Codfish. Yeah, codfish is a big thing. Yeah. So.
They could be called Penobscot.
And the Wampanoag were big fishermen too. You know, they fished, you know, shallow waters and rivers, but they were coastal people. They had these big outriggers. They'd go out after things, not whales. There's another a fish called a grampus, which is like 50 feet long or something.
Yeah,
they'd go after those things. About that size. Yeah.
A killer whale, yeah. The grampus is a killer whale.
John, you want to talk a little bit about the idea of historical fiction?
Yeah.
Is that a good way of learning history? What do you think?
Oh. Well, that's, yeah, so, you know, when I was a kid, I loved history. I mean, I couldn't get enough of it in school, but I know a lot of kids don't want to hear history.
Yeah.
That's old stuff. Why do I have to learn about these guys wearing those funny hats and those knee pants?
Dates.
You know, the what?
Learning dates.
Well, dates, yeah, right. So, I mean, I'm writing a fair amount of historical fiction, and as Todd mentioned, I belong to the Historical Novel Society, which is for writers and readers of historical fiction. And I always feel it's a good way to learn, to learn history through story, through novels. Some of you know that I've written books about ghosts, and one of my books was used in one of the Athens schools. I can't remember, which one did Sonia teach at? Do you know that? Sonia Coleman? Anyway, whatever school she was teaching at, I forgot. They used my book in their social studies course. And the part they used was where I talked about, what's his name? Morgan, Confederate General John Morgan, when he came through Morgan's raid. And I talked about the furnace out here. What's the name of the furnace? I forgot already.
At Lake Hope.
The what?
The furnace over at Lake Hope.
Yeah, but I can't think of it. Is this called Lake Hope Furnace? Maybe? I don't know. But it was built, those furnaces were built and very active during the Civil War, producing a lot of iron for cannons and all. So I wrote about that, the Confederates coming through and all that kind of stuff. And Sonia used that in school, and she had all the kids drawing pictures about it. And it was a ghost story, but it was historical fiction, sort of twisted, perverted way. But it worked.
Twisted.
Well, have they ever cleared up who were the actual first people that touched the East Coast? Were they Norwegians or who?
They don't know. I mean, there's talk about Vikings,
But
being the first.
Finland.
There's been some stones that were found, like in Maine and New Hampshire, that had inscriptions on that were almost looked like old Icelandic or things like that, but nobody really knows for sure. There's some evidence for Norsemen, though, having touched maybe Nova Scotia, that area, not necessarily settled. If you read some of the old, there's a thing called the Volsunga Saga, which is these old Icelandic ballads. And there's one where the Norsemen go to, it's Greenland, and then they move further west. We don't know where, but further west could be North America. They talk about encounters with people called Skraelings, which of course would have been some Icelandic Scandinavian name.
Yeah.
And Skraelings, when you read about it and how they fight and the weapons and all, it sounds like you're talking about Native Americans. So it's possible.
But the English were the first people that brought families.
In New England,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, they've been the first to actually
Went
settle.
to Jamestown, too.
Right, Jamestown and then up in New England. Well, at the same time, though, the Dutch were here, too. The Dutch were in what's today New York, New Amsterdam. And they were arriving at the same time. In fact, Connecticut, when I talked about the Pequot thing, part of the Pequot War was fought over the fur trade. And the fur trade was trying to be controlled by European powers. You had the English and the Dutch. And the Dutch had a trading post in Connecticut, pretty much where I used to live, in western Connecticut, sort of around what's today Fairfield, Bridgeport, if you know the area. So they had a trading post there at the same time the Pequot War was going on.
And where?
In Connecticut, western Connecticut, maybe around Fairfield or Bridgeport. So the Dutch were a power there too, but relatively small, in what's today New York, and then going up the Hudson River, up the Hudson Valley a little bit. When they brought families. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And then of course you had the Spanish in Florida, who had already been there 100 years before, before Jamestown and St. Augustine, and in the West too, West Coast.
Did you ever find in the things that you read, did some of the people that came hope to get back? Of course, the pilgrims were supposedly persecuted, but I mean, it would be hard to leave your home if you didn't think you'd ever see it again. Or did they really think that they were going to the end of the earth and they would never see it again?
I think that's what they thought, because what they did first was, they were in England, and they ran into trouble in England because of their dissension from the orthodoxy powers. So they went to Holland, which was more liberal, and they settled in Holland. And they thought Holland was going to be where they were going to stay. But what they found out was that they settled, this particular group of people that came to Plymouth, settled in Leyden, Holland, which was primarily an industrial town. They were agriculturalists, they were farmers. So that didn't work out. They felt a little out of their place there. But what was happening was their children were starting to speak Dutch. They were starting to take on Dutch habits, hang out with Dutch people. Well, we can't have that. because the Dutch weren't the same people as us. So once again, they said, we have to leave. So they packed up from there and eventually made their way to here. So they were looking for, when they built Plymouth, they called it the New Jerusalem. You know, that was a nickname. They called it New Jerusalem. They called it the Kingdom on the Hill. So they were looking to settle. It was agricultural, just like them, and they can be sort of isolated. They were all the same. The irony is, these are people that were fleeing religious persecution, yet you could not be anything other than a Congregationalist in Plymouth. The Indians certainly weren't, and that's part of this religious intolerance. They were fleeing religious intolerance only to impose their own religious intolerance.
Well, the same thing happened in Jamestown. If it weren't for the Methodists, we would all be Church of England, because that was going to be the law there, that you had to be Church of England.
Right. And when the Mayflower Compact was written, you know, these guys all wrote it on board the Mayflower before they got off, because what I meant to say was they were rerouted because they didn't want to land where they were supposed to land. When they went to Plymouth, they didn't have a charter to be on Plymouth. They were basically landing in Plymouth illegally. They didn't have a king charter or anything else to do it. So they wrote their own charter. They said, we don't need the king because we're our own people, we're God's people. Yeah. And they called it the Mayflower Compact. They signed it on board the Mayflower. And it says, pretty much, we're Congregationalists. You know, we believe in God. God's directing us. We'll take it from there. Thank you.
Well, who would you get a charter from for
well, most of them got charters from these companies that formed, like Massachusetts Bay Colony was a company, was incorporated. So was the Virginia, what they call it, the Virginia, is this a Virginia colony or a Virginia something? But they would get a charter from the king. And the king would basically say, okay, go ahead, you know, you can go out and you can explore this general area and settle, because they're, you know, king's figuring we're going to get revenue from there or whatever it is, you know. So that's the story. Another question? Todd.
Who was your favorite character or characters to write about in the story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was definitely on the side of Philip, being, you know, kind of a Native American fan, if you want to call it that. Yeah. But what came to me more was not just the fact that he had rough times, but that he was trying, as near as I can figure, to hold it all together. So I learned that. I learned more about him in depth. I learned more about John Eliot, too. He wasn't just a simple missionary. And you know, in some ways I sort of pan those efforts. But his intentions were good, as far as he knew them. They were good. They didn't work. But he was a man doing what he believed was the right thing and the moral thing. So I learned to respect him more. But I think I still sided with Philip, you know, and I think I got more in depth with him than what research had taught me. And it is fiction. It's historical fiction. So I took some liberties. I mean, I don't know what these characters were thinking, really, at the time. Yeah. I don't really know what they said. I have Philip's quote, and there's a couple other, you know, quotes that you can pull out, but I'm making assumptions based on what I think probably went for them. And so I got more into Philip.
Poetic license.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Did you work in any important characters that were fictional but plausible?
So much of them are actually real characters. I'm trying to think.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I really try to sort of follow the script, if you will, you know.
Any women in it?
Oh, yeah. There's John Eliot's wife, Anne Mountfort, is in here. Doesn't have a very strong presence, but she is in it. Eliot had, I think, 3 children. One was a son who was like the favorite son and destined to take on his father's role as a minister and all this, and he died when he was like 30 or something, so that didn't work out. He had another son who was, they don't know exactly what his issues were. He had some kind of developmental issues and was basically like a child all his life. They had a daughter. So yeah, there was her. Philip had 2 wives, and they actually figure in here. One of them figures in here very strong because she was a captive of Sassamon. John Sassamon, during the Pequot War, fought with the English against the Pequot. And he took a slave, it was a woman, and that became his, I don't want to say wife, it was a slave. She's in there, and she is, actually, she's a fictional character.
Oh.
I remember, so she's one. But Philip also had a wife, a tribal, a Wampanoag woman who is in there too as well. And there's not a lot of fictional characters in there, mostly all real people. Yeah. Which made it harder, really.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to put it together, and I'm trying to sort of follow what the history said. So when you're writing historical fiction, you can take some liberties, but you also have to, you have to kind of adhere to the story. You can't say, well, Lincoln wasn't shot. Well, no, he was.
Yeah.
You can't change. Although there's a whole new genre called alternative history,
Right.
Oh, yeah.
in which Lincoln isn't shot.
Oh, yeah.
There's one, I don't know how many novels have been written about the South winning the Civil War, about Germany winning World War II.
Man
You
in
know.
High Castle.
Yeah, exactly. Those are interesting. I don't write, I mean, I like to write what really happened. It's more
John, how about some of the struggles you had with the language, like what to,
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. When I started writing this, I think the first time I started, this went through I don't know how many revisions before it got to where it got to now. But what I was struggling with was trying to, how do I make 17th century Wampanoag sound like 17th century Wampanoag and yet be understandable to us? For that matter, how do I make 17th century Englishmen speaking English sound like us? Because they wouldn't sound like us. They had a very strong, these people in Plymouth had a Northumbrian English accent. I have no idea what that is, but it's different from other English accents, and it's very difficult. So I tried it at first, writing it the way I think the English would have sounded, trying to use that 17th century vernacular and syntax and everything else. And it was horrible. I mean, I wrote I went through the entire thing, wrote the entire novel that way.
Wow.
And yeah.
Wow.
That's why.
Do you still have it though?
It's still in one of my files somewhere,
I would
yeah.
like to read that.
Yeah, and that's what I read. I said, man, it was all these these and thous and, wish thou canst. And I said, oh man, no one's gonna, this is not gonna fly. So I ditched it all, and I thought, well, can I just write it like we speak today? And I said, well, I can't do that either. I can't say, yeah, right, because they didn't say, yeah, right. They may have said, I believe thee mistaken,
Yeah,
it would have been, yeah, right. So I couldn't write that, right? So what I did is I created what I call kind of a hybrid language, which is English easy enough for us to understand, but maybe using some words or references that would have been 17th century. So, instead of saying, I don't know, like we might say a mug of beer, let's say.
Cup of
Well, a cup of joe, okay. I mean, it may have been more like, a tankard probably is more 17th century. That's a word that we still use, but rarely.
Right.
You don't go to a bar and say, I'll have a tankard, my good man. You don't do that. So,
I reject you.
yeah, so I tried that, and what I also did too was I would drop in words. So for the Native Americans, I actually have some Algonquin in here that, some phrases. Now, I translate the phrase right after because I don't expect anybody to speak Algonquin, including myself. But I was able to find some kind of a phrase book, a very short one of some Algonquin phrases that I could use in here. So I worked it. But I would use words. For instance, here's one. It says, this is Philip talking about he had a brother, Alexander. Again, these are English names. His brother's name was Wamsutta, but the English called him Alexander, and they called Metacom Philip. They were both sons of Massasoit. When Massasoit died, Wamsutta, Alexander, became sachem. But he died within about a year or so under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned, possibly by the English. So Philip takes his place. So here's Philip reflecting. He says, this is Philip, he remembered all too well the fear in his brother's eyes when the Wotakonenge, Winslow, held a pistol to his chest. Now, what's a Wotakonenge? It turns out, basically is an Algonquin word that means like cutthroat. Like So Winslow was the governor at that time, and he pulled a pistol on Alexander and forced him to walk to a village for, it's in the book. But so that word is an Algonquin word. So I would do that, and I used it previously in the text too, so you know what it was. You'd have to remember it. But so I will do that from time to time, just to sort of get a little bit of the flavor of what Algonquin must have been like. And there's, like I said, there's one scene where Philip talks to his brother and his father. He talks to the spirits of his brother and his father. Remember, I write ghost stories. He talks to their spirits who come to visit him, and they speak in Algonquin. They exchange a couple of phrases in Algonquin, which I translate. But other than that, language is a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Deciding what language to use. And this is true of anybody writing historical fiction at any time.
How about the length of time that you spent on this compared to one of your other books?
This was a lot longer. I mean, my other books, for instance, my ghost books, which, you know, a lot of people know those. Those are, regardless of your point of view, they are written as nonfiction. You might think they're fiction, but they're written as nonfiction. And nonfiction is easy for me to write. I mean, it really is, because it's facts. They're all there. It's just a matter of organizing and putting them together. But this is all sort of imaginative. I mean, there are facts because it's historical. But putting it together and visualizing scenes and visualizing dialogue, visualizing inner thoughts, all that is me. So that's more work. It's more fun, but it's more work.
More fun?
I think so, yeah. Total fiction, you know, my agent has 2 novels right now of mine that he's trying to sell. And, you know, they're not historical. They're different. So start to finish is all my imagination. Everything, plot, structure, you know, characters, nothing is real in there. So that was really great because you become God. You know? You do whatever you want.
I am almighty.
You're God in that world anyway, you know. Then my wife says, "You're not God." I said, "Okay." Guess you don't believe in God. So anyway, but yeah, so they all take. So I said the research on this was a long time, whereas the other books didn't require that much research. But that was a big deal, and doing all the successive drafts because of things like language and everything. You know, when I write the other novels, I know language. I use what I want to use, and I don't have to go back and change that. So.
What about the cover? What is that? Where is that?
It looked like
Well,
ice.
what it's supposed to be, and I hope it looks that way, it's supposed to be a pond, an icy pond.
Yeah, I thought so.
There's supposed to be kind of a hole, I guess, where it's dark blue. You can see some, it doesn't show up too well, but way up top where the words are, there's like some pine trees, like the shore.
Yeah.
Oh,
So what it refers to is, you know, finding Sassaman in the pond, in the ice.
Oh, no.
So, I mean, you know, the artist designed this. She read the book and she said, "What do you think I should focus? What are some images?" I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe the pond, maybe whatever." She liked the idea of the pond. So.
it's like an arrow.
Oh yeah, that's
Oh,
true. I didn't see that. You're right. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I like that. It's even
Yeah.
better. And so people say the title, you know, say the Savage Apostle, and that can refer to either Eliot, who is an apostle to the savages, or it could apply to Sassaman, who was a savage for an apostle.
John, we must thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.